Welcome to the Good Beer Hunting Collective podcast, the show where members of our team interview each other to get a behind-the-scenes look at some of our favorite articles. I'm Beth Demon, and I host the Good Beer Hunting Collectives. The overlaps between beer and whiskey are plentiful. Both rely on craftsmanship and quality ingredients and share certain production methods in common. Modern makers in either category have the luxury of looking at tradition while pushing the boundaries of innovation for the future. But it's the differences between the two that keep things interesting. Single malt whiskey producer Stranahan's in Denver, Colorado is one such modern maker, one that's helping to define the budding American single malt whiskey category against Scotch and other international players. A visit in 2018 led writer Gabby Farms to dive into their process, history, and position as Colorado's first new legal whiskey distillery since Prohibition for her latest piece in Good Beer Hunting titled Whiskey and the Mile High City, the distillery making single malt in the Rocky Mountains, which was published on June 16, 2021. In our conversation about her piece, which was written for our Beer and a Shot series, made in partnership with Miller High Life, Gabby reveals what led her to spotlight a producer who she feels is at the forefront of an American spirits revolution. Not only does their early entry into the category position Stranahan's at the vanguard, but their literal mile-high location also serves to shape their products in a unique way. In our conversation, Gabby discusses how she prefers her single malt whiskey, neat, or perhaps with one cube, and which beverages she tends to pair with barbecue. It's not light lager, as I incorrectly presupposed. She also muses on what the future holds for American whiskey makers, finds some silver linings in the wake of COVID, and believes there's truly a whiskey for everyone. If American single malt whiskey has a cheerleader, it's Gabby Farms. Listen up as she dives in. Hi, Gabby. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm so excited to be able to join you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, first off, huge confession. I don't really know much about whiskey specifically at all. So this piece was fascinating for me.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to write.
Well, let's talk about writing it. You know, you're an entertainment writer, you're a drinks writer, you live in Texas. What made you want to explore this story about single malt whiskey made in Denver?
So, funny story. Several years ago, I would say back in 2018, 2018, I went to the Stranahan's distillery for their release of Snowflake, which they finish in different casks. And it was just such an amazing experience because they had people from all over the country camping out, all just for the love of this American single malt. And it just was such an amazing experience, and I loved their whiskey. And so, long story short, that's what really motivated me to get the background story of Stranahan's.
That's one of the great things about being a writer is that you can find something that really interests you and you're like, oh, I have a good excuse to explore that a little bit more. But, you know, when in your research, when you were talking to sources and starting to put this together, did you find kind of a common thread of what sets Denver apart when it comes to making whiskey or even food and drink in general?
Yeah, so one of the things that I thought was really cool, I knew that Denver had a ton of microbreweries and distilleries, but from my research, I found out that within Denver, there's over 150 different, not distilleries, breweries, excuse me. So a lot of it from what I gathered from the master distiller Owen, he even said he didn't think Stranahan's would be there without the craft beer culture that has sprung up in Denver.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like even just in general, obviously within Denver, but outside of it as well, it seems like there is a lot of overlap between whiskey and craft beer. There's that appreciation for the artistry, there's the hyper awareness of ingredients and where they come from, the need for consumer education. And in the piece, you do describe how beer is kind of complementary to whiskey and other spirits in Denver. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And I mean, do you think that that's a unique thing in Denver or something that's relatively common in the drinks industry?
I would say yes, it's relatively common, but at the same time, because of Denver's beer culture, for example, Stranahan's in particularly, from what Owen had told me, their master distiller, they use all these specialty malts to basically brew a porter, and then that's what they distill. So it's truly coming from beer, this product. So it makes it fun to just learn about the whole process and how it goes from this malted beverage to continuing to be a malted beverage. With the single malt being 100% malted barley. So it's wonderful. I mean, I really loved telling this story.
Well, and I loved reading it, and even especially thinking about Denver drawing influence from craft beer, but also their ability to access local ingredients like, water and barley, and even being so much higher above sea level. I mean, I live in San Diego, I'm at sea level, or, elevation 12 maybe. But the whole concept of like how the angels share is different because of where they're located, having, a more complex finished product. It's higher proof in general.
Hmm.
So it does seem like Denver has a very specific approach and a really unique end product. I mean, would you say that that's true or?
Oh yeah, definitely. To your point, their altitude, with it being so high, it definitely makes it have like a unique angel share loss. And what I thought was interesting with Stranahan's, they actually lose more out of their barrels than if they were aging at like here in Texas, where most of Texas is either at sea level or below sea level, and it just results in with having a higher proof and a more complex flavor profile. So, absolutely, you were correct.
Well, and I feel like that goes back to talking about conversations of, the T word, terroir.
Yeah,
It can be a super loaded term, but
yeah,
when you hear or when people are talking about making Colorado whiskey with Colorado ingredients, it seems sort of inescapable to talk about. So, what do you think sets Colorado whiskey, or even American single malt whiskey in general, apart from what's being made in, Europe, Japan, or anywhere else in the world?
well, I would have to say that for Stranahan's in particular, I can't really speak on the other brands because I know some Colorado brands aren't grain to glass. But in the case of Stranahan's, they distill, age, and bottle everything on site. They use local water sources. Um, I'm drawing a blank, but I believe they use Rocky Mountain snow melt. But do
Hmm.
not quote me on that. I'm drawing a blank right now, but yeah. And now I forgot what your question was. I think I
Oh,
went on a tangent.
just talking about terroir and
Yeah,
what sets Colorado apart, or but yeah, I mean, I think the specific ingredients, the access to very specific water. I mean, even think about in beer cores, it's the taste of the Rockies. Like there's obviously
yeah,
something there.
yeah. And actually, yeah, it is from the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so I was right with that. And it just deserves its own category. I mean, you see, there's definitely a bourbon boost. Scotch also has its loyal followers, but American single malt is such a new and growing category for people that are into whiskey.
Yeah, and I think you even mentioned in the piece that it was Colorado's first legal whiskey distillery
Right.
since Prohibition. And I mean, that was the the late 90s, if not the early 2000s, when they kind of came online. So that's only, what, 2 decades old?
Right.
That's relatively fresh, like a burgeoning category for sure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, being that it's such a young category, it definitely, Owen and the team, they have, they can have a ton of fun with it and just kind of help define as the category continues to grow.
So we're talking a lot about single malt whiskey, and I feel like a lot of the listeners can might know what that is, and it might be obvious, but the people who are listening might be mostly craft beer drinkers. So for those
Mhm.
who are less familiar with whiskey and spirits, what are some of the differences in how you sip, smell, or taste whiskey versus the way that we might try beer? What are some of the things that you should be looking for when you're approaching these products?
Well, funny enough, just like with a bourbon or even a rye, it's all about the person's own palate. Some people like single malts in a spirit forward cocktail, while others, in my case, I like to drink it neat or with a cube. But basically, in short, American single malt, 100% malted barley. Some of it's matured in ex bourbon barrels, for example, which kind of gives it even more robust flavor, or other different oak barrels as well. Um, yeah. So, in terms of tasting it, I mean, you nose and taste it the same way you would do any other whiskey, really.
Hmm. So, I mean, just personally, do you prefer a single malt or a blend in general? Like, what types of products appeal to you in this category?
So even though I wrote about single malt, my first love is bourbon. And the first story I actually wrote for Good Beer Hunting was on Milam and Green and their whiskey here in the Austin, Texas area. They create a bourbon, they create a rye. I mean, they're just amazing. So when it comes to my preferences, it's definitely bourbon, but I love a good single malt, and Stranahan's definitely delivers.
Hmm. Are you much of a beer drinker, or spirits really what you're going for, what you're passionate about?
With barbecue, I'll have a beer. I'm typical Texan when it comes to that. Um, I'll have a bourbon either with barbecue or porter. I love porters. Like
Wow.
I like vanilla porter, that Cork and Barrel. It's a new microbrewery that's here in the area, here in Austin area. They brew their own beer, and they have this delicious vanilla porter that I just could wax poetic about over and over forever.
I will admit, I don't think I've ever paired a porter with barbecue. I was fully anticipating you being like, "Oh yeah, Lone Star," or "Oh yeah, hams," or something like that.
No, I go for the intense, the intensity. I love a good porter.
Nice. Nice. Well, one of the things, I mean, it's just speaking as also a porter lover, but somebody who can appreciate, if not articulate, how much I like whiskey, I like bourbon. I couldn't tell you nearly as much about them as I could something about beer, but I think the concept of like single malt versus a blend kind of appealed to me when I think about things like smash beers or, single apple variety ciders and being able to explore the complexities and nuances of very specific ingredients along with how they change over time. And it seems like th- this story made it seem like there's just this total microcosm of spirits that are happening in Denver, both due to the ingredients that they have access to, the
Mhm.
elevation that they're at, the influence from craft beer. I mean, I would be hard pressed to find a comparison to anything similar happening anywhere in the world. I mean, this really seems like
Right.
it might be at the forefront of a bit of a renaissance. I mean, where do you see the American whiskey industry going?
I definitely see that it's becoming, like to your point, it's growing and it's so unique. I mean, you have these different distinct whiskey categories that, Japanese whiskey, you have your bourbons, you have your Irish whiskey. There are so many different whiskeys, but what's so fun about the American single malt category is the fact, it's particularly Colorado with Stranahan's, just the innovation, and it's setting trends in terms of the flavor profile. And I would say that they even Stranahan's is what I'm referring to. They released their first ever 10-year-old, which was amazing, and they actually partnered with Bushmills too. So it just goes to show you there's a lot of versatility with American single malts, and Stranahan's is really paving the way.
We'll be right back with Gabby Farms.
Hi, this is Michael Kaiser, founder and creative director of Good Beer Hunting. I just want to take a quick break and tell you about how GBH editorial is supported and the teams that enables. GBH is underwritten in part by Guinness. Guinness has been in America since 1817, where it's been part of the beer drinking experience ever since. Now they're part of the U.S. brewing tradition as well. They've renovated a former distillery site in Baltimore, Maryland, into an experiential brewery, taproom, and visitor center, where they've assembled a team of highly regarded craft brewers to combine their creativity with over 260 years of Irish beer, knowledge, and resources. They bring everything from white ales to saisons to barrel-aged barley wines. It's an utterly unique space in the world of beer. Its evolution is astounding, and how we think about that brewery and brand is different for everyone. You can listen and watch at goodbeerhunting.com/Guinness. GBH is underwritten in part by Menabrea, an Italian brewery that you'll find in stylish bars around Milan and Turin, and increasingly in the U.S. as more drinkers seek out classic European beer traditions. In the long wake of an international zeitgeist, the world is rediscovering these styles and traditions that have been perfected and refined for generations. Craft is giving way to craftsmanship. Menabrea is helping us bring you a series called Age of Rediscovery, devoted to exploring beer cultures that have withstood the test of time and stand ready to be enjoyed by a new and adventurous generation of beer drinkers. For more, visit goodbeerhunting.com/Menabrea. Thanks for that moment. Now back to the podcast.
I'm so glad that you brought up the Bushmills thing, because I thought that was really interesting that they not only partnered with Bushmills, but how stoked they were on it. And I tried to imagine the beer equivalent of a small independent brewery partnering with an overseas or global conglomerate and being like genuinely psyched. And do you feel like that kind of self-promoted struggle between, David and Goliath, that happens so often in beer? Do you see that happens in whiskey at all, or kind of not really?
Well, you have the big whiskey producers and you have the smaller distilleries, of course. But I think what makes this partnership with Bushmills so special is because of Owen's background. I mean, his first, and I mentioned this in the story, he had his first dram in Scotland, and he went to actually shoot it. And they were like, no, this isn't like a whiskey that you shoot. You just enjoy it and you slow sip it and appreciate the different complexity and flavor profile. And it's a full circle moment with the fact that he was able to collaborate with Bushmills. So I just think that's such a fun story.
I loved it. And it was just in such direct contradiction with the kind of narrative that beer perpetuates. And I mean, I think I saw an estimate or something that there are around 2,000 or so distilleries in the United States. Of those, I have absolutely no insight whatsoever into how many are single malt whiskey makers. I would imagine a small percentage of that. But, compared to that, independent craft breweries are something like 8,000 or close to it. I mean, do you see that? Do you feel like whiskey is headed to be the same sort of trajectory as beer, more of a parallel growth path? I mean, it's still early, but do you have any insight into how many distilleries or even single malt makers are coming online in the United States?
To be quite honest, I don't have like a finite number, but I know Stranahan's is at the forefront. and along with there's a Portland-based Westward whiskey. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
I am. I actually, shockingly enough, that is somebody that I have been in touch with for different stories. So, oh my gosh,
Oh, cool.
I feel very in the know.
Yay! Yeah, awesome. Yeah, they produce American single malt, and yeah, they're definitely in the minority there. That the space when it comes to producers within the whiskey world that make American single malt. So Stranahan's and Westward are the two I can immediately think of, but I know there's some other producers. But to your point, there's not many compared to the other categories of bourbon and rye and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so kind of swinging back just to the process of writing this piece, I mean, was there anything that didn't make it into the story that really surprised you, or anything, any challenges that you came across when writing this?
That's a great question. I think the biggest challenge for me for this particular piece was understanding the correlation between the craft beer scene in Denver and how it matched with the Stranahan narrative. And then also tying in Jess Graber, who he was a co-founder of Stranahan's along with George Stranahan, but he's now the founder of Tin Cup Whiskey. So getting his story and seeing how they met, that was something that was news to me. I mean, I knew he was a co-founder, but I didn't realize how they met. So that was definitely something that I'm glad I added to the story.
Awesome. Well, now that the story has been out for something like a week and a half, 2 weeks or so, what's the reaction been to it? You know, what have you seen that people have been taking away, or, you know, it's touched them in some way? How have you seen the reception play out so far?
Well, so far from what I've been told, a lot, well, not a lot, but a relatively, well, significant amount of people, they've told me that they really appreciated the fact that I went into detail about the whole Stranahan story and the background, and then what Owen is planning to do in the future and how they've overcome some of the challenges with COVID. I mean, COVID really impacted distilleries and breweries everywhere. But they were able to overcome those challenges and just really forge ahead. I mean, they were still able to do their limited edition bottle release with their Cask Thief series. And that was something that I thought was impressive, considering we weren't hosting events anywhere, really, in-person events. So that was something very unique. And yeah, the overall reception to the story has been just appreciating the actual Stranahan story being told and them receiving their flowers.
Definitely. And I mean, I have to say, COVID was obviously such a huge disruptor, to say the very least. But I imagine that businesses who rely on the luxury of time to hone their products, hopefully it gave them an opportunity to hold on to some stuff, and, you know, maybe something special will come out of that extra year of isolation. That would certainly be a silver lining and something that I would hope for.
Yeah, and actually, I would like to note this, since you brought it out. I think one silver lining in all of this, they did just celebrate their 15th anniversary, and then they released and I mentioned this in the outset. They released their first ever 10-year-old single malt, which is something that first time ever. And it's called Mountain Angel. So it's their oldest and rarest bottle to date.
Well, and I loved that you even said that they didn't release any of the, you know, slightly younger products like, you know, gin or vodka or things like that, to bridge that gap between starting to distill before releasing, which takes a couple of years. I mean, I'm even thinking about some of the distilleries here in San Diego. And yeah, everybody starts pumping out some of these clear spirits while you wait, and that was something that struck me as different in this particular story.
Yeah, and George and Jess, the founders, they knew that they wanted to focus on American single malt. And so patience definitely played a very important role here with the timing. And they didn't want to venture into unaged spirits. They really wanted to do a whiskey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that commitment to craft and the end product is definitely admirable. And I think that we're all lucky to be on the receiving end of their time and patience and labor. But do you have any other last thoughts, final words about the piece, or anything that you want people to walk away with after reading this?
The biggest thing I want people to walk away with from my story is knowing that American single malt is a growing category. It definitely can stand up to the other categories that are more popular, like the bourbons and the ryes and the foreign, like Japanese whiskeys and scotch and so forth. There's definitely a palate for it, and just keep an open mind.
Keep an open mind. I like that. We'll end with that, but also, where can people find you on social media or read other work that you've done?
So you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Gabby Nikki, GABBYNIKKI. Both accounts follow me. And then my website is also www.gabbynikki.com.
Perfect. I hope everybody keeps up with you. And I, for one, think I might switch up my usual evening pint for maybe something a little bit neat later. So thanks for the inspiration.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
That was Gabby Farms, author of the piece, Whiskey in the Mile High City, the distillery making single malt in the Rocky Mountains. You can find this story and many more on goodbeerhunting.com. Thanks for listening.